Welcome to the African News Review podcast, where we cut through the noise and get to the truth. I am your host, Adesoji Iginla, and each week we are here to challenge the biases, prejudices, and misinformation in the Western press about Africa. Using historical context and contemporary insights, we set the record straight and reclaim the narrative. Tune in every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern as we uncover the real stories and reshape the conversations about Africa. This is the African News Review podcast, reclaiming Africa's narrative, one story at a time. Yes, greetings, and welcome to another episode of African News Review. I'm your host as usual, Adesoji Iginla. Me is the legend himself, Comrade Milton Allimadi. Because
Thank you, my comrade, my brother. Thank you.
yes. So first things first, protocol. How are you? How was the week? How have you been?
I mean, the weather's been, great. We're talking like 60 degrees Fahrenheit.
Summer.
Pre-summer, man. I'm happy. I'm very happy. I hope it continues. And you?
Okay.
How's
Yeah,
the
I
UK?
mean, the UK has been it's been hovering in the, how can I say, the low tens, so that would be
you have to translate that for us.
so that would be like that would be 15 degrees your end. So it's freezing basically.
Wow. Brother.
Yeah, so it's freezing, it's raining, and so that's spring already, but with
Keep
the
hope
rain.
alive. Keep hope alive.
True. Speaking of hope, for our first story, we go to the money paper, the FT, and it comes with the story that the US of A declares South Africa's ambassador persona non grata.
Right.
So the headline reads, US declares South African ambassador persona non grata as Secretary of State Marco Rubio expels Ibrahim Rasool after he criticized Donald Trump in an online lecture. That's the man himself. Secretary of State Marco Rubio declared South Africa's ambassador to the US persona non grata on Friday, describing him as a race-baiting politician who hates America. Do you want to respond to just that part first?
It's ironic that if you switch the names, you'd wonder, who he's talking about, right?
Yes.
Yeah. But it's the old tactic, right?
Very
Well,
much so.
The perpetrator always throws it
Yeah.
against, the victim. I mean, all I can say is, but, okay, granted, ambassadors normally don't speak the way he spoke. But at the same time, presidents normally don't speak the way the president of the United States has been speaking as well.
Nor act as the president.
Right?
Yeah.
Normally, people don't see a president of a country and his vice president almost mug the president of another country who's visiting. Live TV. So, Rubio is being very disingenuous by behaving as if this is something so outrageous that Ambassador Rasool has done. Okay. It's not usual that diplomats speak like that. I grant it, but we have to put it in the context of which it's been playing out. When that meeting with Zelensky happened, anybody can go back and watch the video. Remember that moment when Rubio himself sunk back on the sofa and literally turned his head away like that? Imagine, for him to do something like that in public shows you even how he himself, the Secretary of State, was taken aback and shocked and even embarrassed by what had just transpired. Correct? But
correct.
obviously, the guy who embarrassed him is the guy who cuts his paycheck as well. So he's not going to say that, this behavior by his own president was
Super.
outrageous or anything
Yes.
like that.
Yes.
You know, he's not going to say that. So he goes and he picks on South Africa. And of course, this is a continuation of a campaign, and we can't say this is something Republican or something Trump. This is the outrageous attacks against South Africa that started during the Biden administration. So let's be frank about it. This isn't a Trump issue. You know, perhaps we can say that the Trump administration is only escalating it now. But, they started punishing South Africa. I mean, even before the lawsuit at the International Court of Justice against Israel, because South Africa had already been building that closer relationship with China and Russia and the BRICS movement. So that alone had already perturbed
put them in
the
the
United
crosshairs.
States.
Okay, I'll continue. And in a post on X, Rubio wrote, Ibrahim Rasool was no longer welcome in our great country, and linked to a report from the conservative Breitbart news site about an online lecture the ambassador gave about the Trump administration's foreign policy and its implication for South Africa. I quote, "What Donald Trump is launching is an assault on incumbency, those who are in power, by mobilizing a supremacism against incumbency at home and abroad," Rasool said on an online event hosted by South Africa's Magobwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. Rasool's expulsion is the latest episode in a rapid deterioration of the relations between Washington and Pretoria since Trump took office. South Africa brought proceedings against Israel at the International Court of Justice at the end of 2023, accusing Israel of violating international law on genocide during its war on Hamas in Gaza, something Israel vigorously denies. Could you just speak to that aspect of reporting when a judgment has already been made?
In terms of?
I mean, it says the South African government accused Israel of violating international law on genocide during its war against Hamas, and then says the country vigorously denies that fact.
Oh, that's just a sentence they just copy and paste from every article, is required, so that they don't get attacked by Israel, who will say this is a one-sided article. So it's like a pro forma motion that they have to go through. But the interesting thing that you said was that, Trump is mobilizing supremacy, right, against incumbency.
Incumbency, yeah.
At home as well as abroad. In other words, he used that tactic to defeat the incumbency of Biden/Kamala at home. And he's also using the same strategy to try to undermine the government of South Africa, the incumbent, of course, Cyril Ramaphosa. That's what he meant by that.
Okay.
And of course, it's an accurate statement. It's just as we said earlier in the beginning of this program today, ambassadors rarely speak like that, especially given the attack that South Africa had already been enduring since the lawsuit was filed against Israel at the International Court of Justice.
Just taking a quick break here on the African News Review podcast, but don't go anywhere. If you're enjoying our deep dive into the real stories behind the headlines, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern, we're here to debunk the myths and bring you the truth about Africa. Want to help spread the word? Share this podcast with your friends and leave us a review. It goes a long way in helping others discover the real Africa. Without further ado, let's get back to setting the record straight. Okay, proceed. Last month, Trump froze foreign assistance to South Africa, partly in retaliation for the ICJ case, as well as his complaints over Pretoria's land expropriation policies, which angered the president and his South African-born billionaire advisor Elon Musk. In his lecture, he repeats the same thing, right? The newspaper then goes on to say, the labeling of an ambassador as persona non grata is a rare and serious diplomatic move. Last month, Rubio skipped a meeting of the G20 foreign ministers in South Africa after accusing Pretoria of anti-Americanism and doing very bad things. What does that mean? I mean, I'm not an American, so what does...
No, nobody knows that. Even Rubio doesn't know that.
Okay.
You know? So when he says
anti-Americanism,
he's not welcome in our great country, right? And then he says, for doing very bad things. Who speaks like that?
His boss.
His boss speaks like that. So I don't even know if he's the one who's writing these things that he's saying. Maybe he's reading it off a script. But this is certainly not Rubio. Rubio doesn't speak like that. Rubio doesn't refer to the United States as our great country. Rubio doesn't say doing very bad things, as if you are talking to a classroom of 5-year-olds and saying, who did this? Who did this very bad thing, right?
Yeah. Wow.
Who broke the glass?
So
I did, teacher, I did.
So one question that jumps out from the article to me is, so effectively what they're saying now is South Africa will be punished for that ICJ case. And it doesn't matter. Go on, you were saying?
No, I'm agreeing with you. Of course. It's like an example. Not only are we not going to let you get away with this, we're going to force you to keep making concessions. And we are setting an example for other countries, not only an African country, any other country that would dare to take on the United States like that. Of course, so many other countries agree with the position that South Africa has taken. But obviously, he's not going to go around doing the same thing to the European countries, for example, who support that lawsuit, right? South Africa is perceived to be the weakest link on the chain, so they can go out to South Africa, you know, while muzzling any further future criticism of that nature as well.
But, I mean, the case is running in the ICJ, and obviously South Africa is not going to withdraw the case. The case is completely out of their hands now. You know,
the withdrawing would bring down, from a process government, definitely.
Okay. So in light of the stance of the United States against South Africa in particular, how does that hamstring South Africa with regards to its internal affairs? Because clearly it's focused on Uncle Sam's antics towards the country. But its internal politics also means he has to react both internally and internationally.
Well, this will benefit, obviously, the economic freedom fighters. It will benefit Umkhonto party, Jacob Zuma's party.
Jacob Zuma, yeah.
Absolutely. Will they take advantage of it? Will they explore an alliance? Will they build this into a movement, prior to the next election? Will they use this moment to educate the next generation of South Africans? Saying, listen, that's why we cannot afford to be dependent on a country such as the United States. Look at what they did with the, cutting off, I think the U.S. funding was covering 25% of the
AIDS program,
healthcare campaign. So you can't afford to be that dependent on a country that can flip-flop like that. Just, generally, we discussed it previously. No African country should be that dependent on external sources of financing. You have to generate as much as you can capital domestically, which of course means that you have to start treating your workers a lot better, paying them a lot better. and allowing them to produce food crops as well, not just cash crops that you rely on for export because you become so dependent on that neocolonial economic model. So in a roundabout way, in an unintended way, in the long term, while the suffering is going to be very intense and immense in the beginning, in the early stages, in the long term, this is perhaps the kind of lesson that African countries needed. And ironically, it's been provided by Donald Trump.
Okay, so before we go on to the next story, I mean, still in South Africa, it's important that we, take a stop and recognize the fact that March 21st, 2025 will mark 65 years since the Sharpeville Massacre. And why is it that clearly the audience is different? But why is it that that is not seen as a more pertinent issue to President Trump and his administration? I'm asking the obvious question.
I understand the reason you answer the question. We know the answer, but I appreciate the question. It is because we do not control global media. We do not have the kind of media that has the capacity or outreach of a CNN or a BBC or a New York Times, even the Guardian. Obviously I prefer the Guardian model because it's not so corporate, dependent. It relies on its own readers. So that's a formula that has worked for them. That's a formula that I highly recommend for more media outlets that want to have that kind of independence. So if, obviously we have that kind of outreach, we would flip the narrative and be able to show how nonsensical it is for the United States president to take that position and use this occasion of the commemoration of that horrific massacre, where the people were merely going there to denounce their past laws, to burn their passes, and say, we are the citizens of this country. We were the indigenous population of this country. We cannot be treated like enslaved people in our own country by being required to carry this internal passport that determines the type of employment you're eligible for, the type of location where you can live. So that was the essence of that march, to go there peacefully, burn the passes, and then submit to arrest. And obviously the turnout was going to be so large that the police would be overwhelmed. And it was supposed to be duplicated throughout the country to show the country how powerful the people coming together really are and how weak the system that was maintaining the apartheid regime really was. Instead, the regime opened with live rounds and killed all those young people. And of course, the organizer was Sobukwe, Robert Sobukwe of the Pan-Africanist Congress. And he was, of course, arrested, and things were never the same for him again, even after he was released years later. Who knows what they did to him while he was incarcerated, because he did not believe. He did not live long after that. Even when he was outside, he was still in prison because he was not allowed to travel. He was not allowed to be in the company of more than one person at a time. So, one of the major casualties, in addition to the young people who were killed, of course, was Robert Sobukwe himself. Who would have been a voice to reckon with in the post-apartheid era.
Yes, maybe well with them. And speaking of South Africa, we go to the AP for our next story. And that comes with the headline saying, wait for it, 67,000 white South Africans have expressed interest in Trump's plan to give them refugee status. The story is filed by Gerard Imre from Cape Town. And it reads, Cape Town, South Africa AP. The United States Embassy in South Africa says Thursday it received a list of nearly 70,000 people interested in refugee status under President Donald Trump's plan to relocate members of a white minority group he claims are victims of an initial racial discrimination by the Black-led government?
So, I mean, this story is it's interesting on several reasons, right? For several reasons, rather. It's no longer shocking because we've heard the announcement made some time back that this is the policy that Donald Trump was launching. But I have some more revealing questions. Number one, the per capita income of Europeans in South Africa, the European South Africans, exceeds the per capita income of white Americans, right? European Americans. So European South Africans have a higher per capita income and standard of living, generally speaking, per capita than European Americans. So the first question is, who would want to abandon something like that? Unless, no, really, unless the person is insane, right? Unless the person is unemployed. And of course, we know they have the lowest unemployment level, but they still have unemployment level, right? So while the unemployment for Africans could be close to 40%, for European South Africans about 8%. So it could be segments of the 8% who would want to leave. It could be wealthy European South Africans as well, who just want to have dual citizenship, to get a U.S. citizenship after they come as refugees, but still be able to go back to South Africa and run their business, or try to start a new business here in the U.S. while somebody is handling their affairs there. I cannot conceive or imagine that a South African who has a huge farm, who's making good money, who's exploiting the labor of Africans to create wealth for himself, is going to abandon that and willingly come to the U.S. to submit himself into a refugee status. And then if I was South Africa, they would say, fine. If this is what you're doing, then you ought to forfeit the land that you're leaving behind. You see? True. Because you're not going to need it anymore. So we'll use that to redistribute
forfeit the land. Forfeit the land and forfeit the citizenship.
Absolutely. Right. So that will be the true test of how many. So you could see that number of 70,000 shrink to maybe, 100 or 200 people, you see. If this thing is really proper, if these issues I've just outlined are addressed, number one, as you said, are you going to renounce your South African citizenship? Are you going to abandon the land and the business that you have in South Africa? Those should be the condition, because you're saying you're a refugee. It means you have no status, right? You want the new state to welcome you and eventually naturalize you and make you a citizen of that new country where you're running. So if these issues are addressed, I want to see how those numbers hold up. I guarantee you it will not be 70,000.
Okay, I'll read some more part. Okay, so apparently the list was given to the embassy by the South African Chamber of Commerce in the US, which said it became a point of contact for white South Africans asking about the programs announced by Trump's administration last month. The chamber said the list does not constitute official applications. Probably they took heed of what that cost would be. I go for that.
The application, in the application, you don't have to answer some of the questions that we've just raised. Are you renouncing your citizenship? Are you currently employed? What do you do? All that kind of information would have to be revealed.
And so you think, you believe
they would look at the
no
questions
one who
and they would walk out of the embassy. Let's put it that way. They would not fill that form, or they would lie on that form, right? But of course, as I said, there are unemployed European South Africans too, and those may come, and then they come here. They would live on welfare, and they'll find out that there are also impoverished European Americans. They'll end up working at McDonald's. They'll end up, some of them end up incarcerated because they'll find that they need to resort to crime in order to survive, or most likely they'll go back to South Africa.
Wow. Paints a very vivid picture.
It does not make sense to flee from the life of privilege to an unknown destination with an unknown.
Okay, one more part. Trump's issued an executive order on the February 7th, cutting U.S. funding to South Africa, citing government's action fueling disproportionate violence against racially disfavored landowners. Trump's executive order specifically referred to Afrikaans, a white minority group who were descendants of mainly Dutch and French colonial settlers who first came to South Africa in the 17th. The order directed Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem to prioritize humanitarian relief to Afrikaners who are victims of unjust racial discrimination and resettle them in the U.S. under refugee program. But there was one part that stood out to me in the piece, and it's this part here. There are approximately 2.7 million Afrikaans in South Africa, which has a population of 62 million. I repeat, there are approximately 2.7 million Afrikaans, which in a country which has a population of 62 million. How does that even make sense?
When they had the land reform, the land act, not land reform, the land act of 1913, the dispossession of 1913, essentially took 90% of the land from the Africans for themselves. And most of the ones who were beneficiaries of the stolen land were Afrikaners, the descendants of the Dutch and French,
and
some German descendants as well. And that is how they were able to monopolize the land in South Africa and dispossess the African population. So in fact, they're the ones, the system was so that the Africans who owned their land were expelled from the land that they owned. Africans that were sharecroppers, right, on the land now owned by the European Afrikaners, were also expelled. So people don't realize how horrific it was. It was like how in this country during the Great Depression, when families were just traveling the road, right? You would drive with your car with all your belongings until the gas ran out, right? Looking for new locations. And then you would continue walking or pushing your car, right? With your belongings in the car. That's what billions of Africans face. With no home, no ability, no ability to support themselves and to continue their life. Who even knows how many died in that process? Then the ones who survived ended up working on the mines or coming back, not as sharecroppers this time, but like basically back to like plantation time, enslaved labor. You see, you're paid just enough to keep yourself alive. That's what the Afrikaners did. And these are the people that Trump, the descendants, are the ones that Trump is saying are the victims and are welcoming to the United States. So people need to know that history.
Thank you for underscoring that point. The perpetrator of violence claiming to be a victim.
Yes.
The worst form of gaslighting ever.
Yeah, but also the British should not get away. The British should not be spared because what happened, as you know, after the so-called Boer Wars between the British imperialists in South Africa and between the Dutch descendant imperialists, the so-called Afrikaners. The Afrikaners were defeated. But then, as the Union of South Africa, the Republic, was being formed, the Union before the Republic, right? In 1910, the British basically said, okay, they ceded power to the Afrikaners and say, do whatever you want to do with the Africans, you see.
You want to do with Africans.
Absolutely. So the British cannot escape this as well, in complicity in what ultimately later on became the apartheid regime. I just wanted to add that.
Okay. And talking of complicity, we go to east of the Congo, which is in the news, and by that is our friend, Mr. General Paul Kagame. And the story comes from the
Then I said, okay.
So the story comes from the New York Times, and it's headlined, Rwanda cuts ties with Belgium over Congo conflict and EU sanctions. Belgium, Rwanda's former colonial ruler, pushed for EU to impose sanctions against Rwandan officials over their role in invading eastern Congo and plundering its mineral wealth.
Okay, no. Why are you going so quickly? Go back and read that again, what you just read.
So, Belgium, Rwanda's former colonial ruler, pushed for the European Union to impose sanctions against Rwandan officials over their role in invading eastern Congo and plundering its mineral wealth.
For their role in doing what?
Plundering its mineral wealth.
Invading eastern Congo. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is that somebody has been listening to our conversations, you know? Never seen it this explicitly before. Speaking truth to power.
From the New York
Invading
Times.
eastern Congo. This is what we've been saying for weeks. Why don't you say it explicitly and to the point? You know? Instead of that, you know, whammy-pammy nonsense. Right. You know, always leading with Rwanda vigorously denying, you know. That's how they normally lead. So what I'm suggesting to our viewers and our listeners is that if you keep speaking the truth, sometimes the truth starts prevailing. Okay?
Yes.
Just keep speaking it. Even when you're the few people who are saying it and speaking it. In this era of social media, information can be multiplied. That's a multiply effect that really transcends what you think may be your limited platform. It goes all over the place, right?
Of course it does.
So when the New York Times starts speaking truth to power and explicitly stating that Rwanda did indeed invade Eastern Congo, as you know, the New York Times has a multiply effect as well. Other media outlets then start reproducing that as well. And the truth starts ascending. And that's what we need to keep doing. Never get discouraged, you know, viewers, listeners, audience. Don't go with the flow. If the flow is wrong and you think you are speaking truth, continue speaking the truth. And events
and pose questions.
People will catch up with you at some point. You know, hopefully sooner rather than later. So I'm happy to see that reference in the New York Times, finally. And for the last 3-4 weeks, we've been saying we hope somebody from there is watching or listening or reading. But you can't be complicit in what Rwanda is doing by not speaking truth to power. So I just wanted to add that.
Okay. So I'll continue. So he goes on. Now, this, you know, when they say picture speaks 1,000 words.
Yes.
Look at the caption of this picture. It says M23 fighters with captured Congolese trucks in Goma, Democratic Republic of Congo. So you are in Goma, you are in Congo, and you've captured their troops.
Right. No, I think we discussed this in a previous episode, that the Congo really lacks commanders. And it shows you robotic soldiers really are. Because soldiers are trained to obey orders, correct?
Yeah, that's the case.
And that's part of the discipline. But part of that also has the downside. When the orders are not coming, you can have thousands of soldiers who are useless because there's nobody to instruct these robots what to do. How can thousands of soldiers not resist an invasion of their country? That would happen if they've been cut off from the command structure, correct? So it shows to me that they have, number one, they have no morale, right?
Yep.
No motivation, no command structure, and they don't have effective commanders, really. And remember, let's go back to even the 1960s, right? And I'm not saying it worked at that time, but it took Che Guevara, think about it, all the way from Cuba to go to Tanzania and then to enter Eastern Congo to try to train resistance troops who are fighting against the Mobutu regime that had just been installed by the CIA and the West after they overthrew Patrice Lumumba. You know? So it shows you the importance of commanders as well.
Yes.
And the Congo, they don't have it. They obviously don't have it. That's why, Rwanda has been able to take Goma, go take Bukavu, and could continue going and taking. But obviously, now,
the world is on.
The people that control this region have said enough is enough, you see? And now, they're reeling in General Kagame. They're saying, no more. And it looks like there will be no more going forward. Certainly nobody's marching to Kinshasa. And even the proxy, M23, no longer making those kind of statements. You recall about 3 weeks ago, they were making those kind of statements.
Yeah. Okay. And so the story is filed by Ellen Peltier. And it reads, Rwanda severed diplomatic ties on Monday with its former colonial ruler, Belgium, which has been pushing to penalize Rwanda over its invasion of neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo. Rwanda's foreign ministry gave Belgian diplomats 48 hours to leave country. It seems as if the idea of expelling diplomats is the running thing this week. The diplomatic escalation came as the European Union, at the urging of Belgium on Monday, imposed sanctions against Rwandan military and government officials for their involvement in the conflict in Congo. The statement from the Rwandan ministry states, Belgium has clearly taken sides in a regional conflict and continued to systematically mobilize against Rwanda in different forums. What's the regional conflict? There is no regional conflict.
No, but that is actually good, because initially they were saying this is a domestic Congolese conflict between aggrieved M23, which represents the interests of the discriminated minorities in Eastern Congo, aka Congolese Tutsi. Now they are conceding that it's a regional conflict, even though it's an invasion. But by saying regional, now he's admitting that it involves nation states, you see?
The power of language.
It's amazing. Whether that statement was approved by Kagame or not.
So it says the European Union accused Rwandan government officials of fueling the conflict through the presence of Rwandan troops in eastern Congo and the plundering of Congo's mineral resources. The sanctions were Europe's first step towards increasing pressure on Rwanda, though so far it has maintained close cooperation on security and strategic minerals. It goes on. The Belgian foreign minister, Maxime Prévost, said in a statement that Rwanda's response is disproportionate and shows that when we disagree with Rwanda, they prefer not to engage in dialogue. He said Belgium will respond in kind to the expulsion of its diplomats. Now, this is a key part. The United States, the European Union, and the United Nations says Rwanda has been funding, supporting, and commanding an armed rebel group, M23, that has fought government forces in eastern Congo for more than a decade and launched new offensive there in January. M23 now controls the region's two largest cities, border crossings with Rwanda, and access to key natural resources, including one of the world's largest coltan mines. Coltan is a mineral that is vital to making smartphones and other electronic devices. M23 is in charge of an area in eastern Congo that is the size of Greece or Louisiana. So now they've laid the reason why they've actually want to stop them in their tracks, because they brought in the coal mine. And you can clearly see that once the coal mine came into being, that's affecting the supply chains. So the supply chains they've leaned on their government. Now the government has come out and said, okay, like you said earlier, enough is enough. But unfortunately for the guys on the ground, come on, we thought that we had a good thing here. Okay, you know what? You guys have to go home.
Yep. They're going to have to go back to their day jobs, you know. In the case of the regular troops of the Rwanda National Army, of course, they'll just, withdraw back to Rwanda.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of these posers who are pretending to lead M23, those are the ones who are going to have to go back to their day jobs, you see. They're not going to end up in Kinshasa after
controlling those mines.
No, controlling Eastern Congo, no. And of course, the new equation in all of this is the outreach that the Congolese government has made to the United States. There's no way that the EU is going to be in a confrontational position with the United States, particularly with this particular president.
Well, you mean the...
Well, absolutely. If they move ahead with this deal that they're discussing with the Congo,
okay,
how would the EU be on the other side, on Rwanda's side? That's not possible.
True.
So things could actually, obviously, Kagame is looking seriously at damage control now as well. And the long-term consequences. I mean, obviously, the solution to all of this is to have one federated East African region. Would eliminate a lot of the problems. The whole Hutu animosity would disappear. Because now, absolutely, now they can move to less dense parts of the East African Federation. They have serious issues. They have land crises in both Rwanda and Burundi. And that's why it exacerbates and intensifies this superficial. When I say superficial, I'm not saying it's not serious, because they have killed each other in the tens and hundreds of thousands. But it's superficial in the sense that the factors behind it can actually be resolved, you see.
So you think it calls into question those land borders?
Absolutely.
Berlin Conference. Yeah.
No, absolutely.
This is a classic case. Yeah.
There are parts of where I come from, in Uganda. We have huge chunks of land which have barely been settled. And other parts of East Africa like that. You see? So it's not that's a coincidence that you have intensified so-called ethnic, when they're the same people.
Tension.
In essence, they speak the same language, the same culture. You have that intense crises in both Rwanda and Burundi. It's not a coincidence that they also have serious, dense population density, Probably some of the most dense in the whole world, So that's the ultimate solution. The solution is not for you to manufacture a so-called internal guerrilla organization, and then you provoke war, you kill thousands of people. Going back to 1997, they're estimating that as many as 6 million people may have died just for you to come and steal, mineral riches. There has to be a better solution. There has to be.
Yeah. We stay in Eastern Congo for, excuse me, we stay in East Africa for the next story. And that comes from another neocolonial state. And this story comes from the AP. And it's titled, Kenya hosts Dutch royals as allegation of rights abuses mount in the East African nation. The story is filed by Evelyn Muzambi and Nicholas Como. It reads, Kenya is hosting the Dutch king and queen as allegations of human rights abuses are mounting in the East African country, with Kenyans writing hundreds of emails and petitioning the royals to cancel their visits. Kenya's government has been accused of arresting and detaining critics, especially after the June anti-government protest, during which demonstrators stormed parliament and touched a section of the building because they were angry over new taxes passed by legislatures. Initial question to you, sir, would be, why would they think the royals would be moved by their emails? Why?
Well, they have to. They have to keep campaigning because you never know what might happen. See?
Yeah, but still.
I'm a big I've been doing emails and petitions for decades. Sometimes it lights fire, sometimes does not. I mean, I did a campaign.
Mhm.
When was this? 2014, I believe, when Sam Kutesa, at that time Uganda's foreign minister, was appointed to be the president of the United Nations General Assembly. I said, why are you rewarding somebody who's essentially serving a criminal regime with that prestigious position? Number one. Number two, this is the same country that has just enacted a law, and regardless of your own position, anybody's position on issues of LGBTQ, they enacted a law that had the death penalty for gay people in Uganda, which goes against everything that the UN stands for. So how could he be elevated to that position, even if it's a symbolic position? It's not the Secretary General, but it's the President of the General Assembly for 1 year. So that campaign started with a few signatures, a few dozen signatures, a few hundred signatures. By the time The Guardian wrote a story about it, it already had 3,000, right? They wrote a story, they quoted me, ended up having more than 15,000 signatures. And I had 7 media interviews. In other words, the guys, it was almost, his campaign to be the president of the General Assembly was almost derailed. It took, in fact, like a U.S. intervention for the guy
to say no.
Because obviously, Uganda had deployed all those troops to Somalia, you see?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
They had to cover for Uganda. Otherwise, the guy could have been derailed with something that started as a petition campaign, right? So petitions can really escalate. After The Guardian, of course, I had about 10 other media outlets contact me for interviews, including that guy on the BBC, the Hard Talk guy, right? Was trying to,
Stephen Saka.
Exactly, grill me. And I was pushing back, You said something like, oh, if it was a successful campaign, why does it have only 15,000 signatures and not more? I said, if it was not a successful campaign, why would you be interviewing me?
Ouch.
I just, the silence completely. Yeah. But no, that's to go back to, so I can understand where the Kenyans are coming from.
Okay.
You never know what catches fire, in other words.
True. Okay, so along with the cracking down on demonstrators and curbing free speech, the country also saw state-linked abductions of young men for social media posts deemed offensive to the president. I wonder when we've seen that before. In December, during protests against widespread kidnappings, and abductions, dozens of peaceful protesters were arrested. More than 20,000 Kenyans signed a petition on change.org asking Dutch King Willem Alexander and Queen Maxima to reconsider their visits last month. The government in the Netherlands said it has received more than 300 emails asking for the cancellation, but the state visit will proceed as scheduled.
Okay, and another.
So it goes on to.
Another good point. Let me just interject quickly. The 20,000 people that sign that, because now you have their contacts automatically. So when you're organizing another future event, you already have an audience of potentially 20,000 that can come to that event.
Start with.
You see? Right.
Okay. Wow. That's one way of looking at it.
Right.
Okay, so we continue. The Dutch royals arrived on Monday night for a 3-day visit. Willem Alexander was honored with 21 gun salute and all the other Arabs. There was little excitement from the Kenyans on the street during the first day of the royal visit. Makaria Munene, a professor of international relations at the United Nations States International University, Africa, attributed it to the low morale that people in the country find themselves in. There's generally low trust for the government and what it stands for, in part because of such critical public institutions as health and education are not working, Munene said. The diplomatic cloud that Kenya used to have has evaporated. Amnesty International on Saturday asked Kenya and the Netherlands to place human rights at the heart of the visit, address human rights violation and commit to accountability for all victims following the recent brutal crackdowns on human rights in the East African country. For those who are probably listening to us for the first time, could you explain to them the history of Kenya and how Kenya came to be in the States?
In the current predicament?
Yes.
Okay, well, it's not unique, actually. It's the history of Africa and the history of Africa's economic relationship with the West. It is the neocolonial economic structure that Africa has. It's not by coincidence that there's not a single industrialized African country. Think about it. It's not because all of the presidents are incompetent, right? Many are incompetent, right? But why is it that all of them have this thing in common? That not a single one of them, their country is an industrialized country. The answer is that because their relationship is a relationship of dependency. You produce tea or you produce cocoa, you produce coffee. These are some of the principal so-called cash crops, right? Or you produce copper, and I should add cotton also on the cash crops. You produce copper, cobalt, coltan, diamond, gold, bauxite, uranium. You sell them in bulk, just like you sell the agricultural products I just listed in bulk as well. Those industrialized countries use these resources in their factories, and then they sell it back to you as manufacture. But because the price that you sell your valuable items, you undersell them, maybe at, who knows, maybe 1% of its value. I don't know. We have to calculate these things. Maybe 10% in some cases. Because your prices are low, obviously, you're going to be short of the funds you need to buy the manufacturers because the price has now gone up exponentially. You see? So you're not producing it. You become dependent on it. Automobiles, computers, smartphones, pharmaceuticals, you name it, manufactured. You continue importing increasing quantities because your population is going up.
Yeah.
So where do you have the money to buy the extra? You borrow, right? That's why you borrow money from the IMF and World Bank to be able to meet your import bill, right? To pay for your imports. And then you have to keep increasing the taxes on your population. That is already increasingly becoming more impoverished. You're adding to their poverty by taxing them so you can pay the interest on the loan you took from the IMF and World Bank to pay for the difference in your import bill. So the Kenyans said enough is enough. And increasingly in many other African countries, the youth are saying enough is enough. The Kenyans took to the street in December 2024. The reprisal was brutal, but at least they pushed back that tax law that had been enacted. The government realized that if we keep insisting on this, it could escalate into a national uprising. So they backed off. But the government has since been abducting people using the Uganda model, Uganda under General Museveni has been doing that for a long time. In fact, there was speculation that Uganda was assisting the Kenyans in these abductions. And then, of course, we got the proof and evidence when one of the leaders of Ugandan opposition movement, Dr. Kizza Besigye, was kidnapped in Kenya by Uganda operatives, taken back to Uganda, which, of course, then proved what people have been speculating all along, that Ugandan operatives are operating in Kenya, assisting Kenya, because this was not something that was widespread in Kenya, but it was widespread in Uganda. Then suddenly in Kenya, people also started disappearing. Some ended up being found dead, some were tortured and released. So that's where Kenya is, and that's why the Kenyans are saying they don't need foreign dignitaries to come there and legitimize this current regime by paying state visits. That's what it's all about.
And it also might be pertinent for people to know that Kenya also had an uprising in its formative states when, like you said, you broke down the neocolonial economy. Kenya now exports in order to import. It sells flowers, coffee, tea to import food.
Yeah, this
with
is
some
really
of the most arable land some of the most arable land on the continent. That is absurd. No?
It is.
So,
yeah, it's absurd in all the African countries that is occurring. There should not be a single African country with food shortage, but there are only 24 hours in a day. If you have farmers growing coffee, instead of food that they can eat, instead of growing, even vegetables, or greens, that happens.
You're growing flowers.
You're growing flowers because you want to export it to earn dollars and euros and pounds. Yes, that is the fight for Africa's independence. The young people must continue to fight for Africa's independence so that they're in a position to decide what they produce. First, satisfy the needs of your stomach and your family, and then grow other things for export. That makes more sense to me than the other way around.
Yep. But unfortunately, again, the power of media and the need to disseminate information like this that has been put into proper context becomes much more important rather than the potty and pap that they're fed in corporate media, or as the great Noam Chomsky will say, content being manufactured from day to day. What else do that kind of thing? It's important that we continue this conversation. Although we've come to the end of this week's episode, next week we're going to be doing a book review, and the book review is one of, I would say, Martinique, but we'll claim him, Africa's greatest thinkers, Frantz Fanon, and the book is titled Towards the African Revolution, Frantz Fanon. And so Brother Milton and I will be looking at this book next week, and we hope you join us then, and hope you've found value in the stories we've gone through today. And if you do, please consider subscribing, sharing the information. You can also download the audio version on all podcast platforms on Monday, first thing Monday morning, and you can listen to it on your way to work or while you go about your normal business. Brother Milton?
Luta continua, remain Pan-African, and see you next week, sister and brother.
And from me, yes, keep thinking African towards an African revolution and towards the African liberation, both mind, body, and space. Until next week, good night and God bless. That's a wrap for this week on the African News Review podcast. We hope you are leaving with a clearer, more truthful picture of Africa. Remember, every story has another side, and we're here to uncover it. Don't forget to join us next Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern as we continue to challenge the narratives and reclaim Africa's voice. If you've enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeing Africa for what it truly is.